Okay, hello everyone and welcome back to Always Watching. For those of you new to this channel, I review all things movie and TV. So if you like what you hear, subscribe, comment, and share the video. So today's Foreign Fridays feature is the French movie A Prophet. Described as a masterpiece, an instant classic, and a perfect film, A Prophet follows Malik, a young French Arab who is sent to prison for 6 years. And this is the type of movie, I can't describe it. It's like, it feels like all the best movies you've watched with something new sprinkled in there, right? It somehow feels original, even though it looks generic. And I watched it 3 times, and the replay value is amazing, right? It remains watchable 10, 20, 30, 40 years later. It doesn't matter how long. This is a movie that is very easy to come back to, satisfaction guaranteed, and you forget that you're watching a foreign film, actually. You forget about the subtitles. And that's how you know it's good. And this movie also has one of my favorite shots in cinema history. Like that lead up to the end and the payoff that you get is so well worth it, right? It's extraordinary. And it hits the same every time you watch it. I was most impressed by Tahar Rahim's performance as Malik. And I thought the decision to cast a French Arab unknown actor, you know, it was a risk that paid off. And it's the type of movie that it's quite difficult, because this is the type of movie that you would cast a known actor for, because you're taking someone and you're turning them into a superstar, right? Like you're taking an unknown actor and you're building them up to be a protagonist and a hero. And it's not unusual for audiences to root for criminals, but a lot of that has to do with the actor playing them, right? Whether it be Al Pacino playing Michael Corleone, or in sort of French cinema context, Mesrine, A Killer Instinct, which is based on France's most notorious serial killer, Jacques Mesrine, which is played by Vincent Cassel. So audiences really love Vincent Cassel. Like, he's a cool guy, he's a pleasure to watch. So they were able to kind of watch the movie, but in this case, it's totally different. Actually, like French audiences are not familiar with this actor, and the director of the film, Jacques Audiard, knew that certain people would be watching this movie in France and they would be rooting against him. He was kind of hoping for it, because the way France's relationship to its Arab population isn't the best, right? They're either portrayed as terrorists, or they're portrayed in like a sociological concept, like this is how the other half lives, you know, type of movie. And a good movie to watch if you're interested is Hate. It also stars Vincent Cassel and is very, very much well worth a watch, especially when you compare it to this film. And one of the things that the film does so well is that it doesn't draw attention to Malik's background. Like, you don't know if he's French, Portuguese, like you don't know what he is in the beginning. And it's not to distract you from the fact that he's Arab. It's to kind of give you a chance to judge him based on what you see in front of you. Like, he's a blank slate, and the movie doesn't allow you to have preconceived ideas of him, right? It's like, okay, here's a guy, you can judge him as the movie goes on. And in terms of the movie's political message, again, it could be read in many different ways. At the time that it was released in France, it did actually spark controversy in terms of the conditions of French prisons. But again, this is not a documentary. They did do some research in terms of what French prisons are like, but a lot of that had to do with getting the actors' mannerisms correct. They also used inmates as extras, which I thought was interesting, and they built the set from scratch, right? Because there's a lot of differences. A lot of what we know about prison is like in an American context. Like, for example, you'll see the inmates here eating in their cell because there's no cafeteria, right? So there's there are some subtle differences, and so it kind of, on one hand, they're able to build this world, and they expanded outside the prison walls. And I thought this was really clever, especially as Malik's journey, as he gets deeper and deeper, the things he starts to do outside of the prison have grave ramifications on what happens to him inside the prison, right? It literally becomes life or death. And this actually gets us more invested in his story, right? You really want to see, where the story is going to go, right? Whether it be good or bad, you like him, you don't, you have to see kind of where this ends. Why was this movie such a crossover success? So this movie was massive when it came out. People were like, this is the French Godfather. And it's unfortunate because with French cinema, they know when to call it quits. Whereas if this was an American movie, they would have kept going until the end of time. Like, they would have kept going and going and going. But sadly, they left it at one. And it would have been a pleasure to watch him grow, especially with this actor. But this is the only movie we get. Like, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure Prophet is one and done. And I think the filmmaker understands that everything has been done before. So he takes an otherwise plot that most people think they've seen or feel like they've seen and makes it feel original. And a lot of that, like, there's a lot of influences here. Like, they kind of balance the American style with the French style. Like, there's a lot of decisions made in terms of music, hallucinations, shots that could have felt super unnatural and forced, but it doesn't. And it actually helps keep the pacing of the film, right? It never feels like a nearly 3-hour movie, right? It's like 2.5. It's a really long film, but it goes by like this, right? It feels like a breeze. And that is something that is not easy to do. So everything that was supposed to work against Prophet, actually, it helps it, right? It kind of makes it a stronger film. And you don't really have to like Malik to understand or sympathize with him, right? During this time in prison, he's able to reinvent himself. He creates his own rules, his own code, his own way of life. Like, he leaves with more of a life than what he came in with. And the longer Malik is in jail, like, he really has to ask himself, you know, is there, he starts to see that there are alternatives. You know, he can kind of build his life in this way. And he's 19 years old, right? And this is very important. This is a time where people are supposed to be building their lives, you know, making new friends. And here Malik is, you know, getting 2 types of education, right? Like, a lot of the things he learns are good things, but a lot of the things are bad. And he kind of has to ask himself, like, what is the cost of this reinvention? You know, is this new me gonna cost me more than my old me, right? Like, he's in there for 6 years, but he could very well come back for 100 years. And that's kind of the question he has to ask himself, right? Like, is it worth it? And what's the price? And actually, the title of the movie, Prophet, is meant as a sort of injunction, moving people to consider something that isn't actually developed in the film. Namely, that we're dealing with a little prophet, a new prototype of a guy. And originally they wanted to name the movie after the Bob Dylan song, Gotta Serve Somebody, that says that we are always in the service of someone. But unfortunately, they couldn't really find a satisfying translation, and they left it at a prophet. I divided my video into several parts, so if you want to see where this is going, you can click the description box down below and jump around. So Malik's rise to power can actually be summed up in a conversation he has with his friend Riyadh. So in this conversation, his friend is telling him about his life outside of prison and how one time he applied for a job as a security officer, but in order to secure the job, he had to adopt a dog. And this dog was a Rottweiler named Tyson. And during one of his shifts, he left the dog alone momentarily to smoke a cigarette. But when he came back, the dog didn't actually recognize him anymore and attacked him. And he tried his best to fight the dog off, but he ended up being chased out of the store. And he's the security guard. And unfortunately, as employees started to come in, the dog, you know, tore everyone to pieces. And I felt like that was an appropriate sort of metaphor or analogy for Malik's story, right? He's kind of like, he was adopted to do this job by this mob, and then he ends up just tearing his owners to pieces, right? Like, ferocious, like, insanely. So the way the movie starts, it's almost like at the end of a story. It begins with tension, it's uncomfortable. We meet Malik, he's been sentenced to prison for 6 years. We don't really know what he's been incarcerated for, and we never really find out clearly, right? Like, it doesn't seem like he's wrongfully convicted. He doesn't really address it. He never has a conversation with anyone to unpack it. Like, we never get a heart-to-heart in terms of why are you in here. He enters the prison and he's totally alone with nothing and no one, right? No one visits him. No one sends him money. You know, when the guard initially asks him, do you want to be with the Muslims? Do you eat pork? He doesn't really say anything, right? So he's literally a blank slate. We don't know if he's violent. You know, it's hard to gauge what kind of person he is. He has scars, these deep scars running up and down his body. You don't know where he got these scars from. Like, he's a total mystery, right? Like, and it's hard for us to judge him right away. right? He just looks like a kid in a very bad situation. In the beginning, he spends all his time alone, trying to mind his own business. And unfortunately for him, a chance encounter in the shower kind of puts him in direct contact with the gang in charge in that prison, and his new boss, Cesar Luciani. And so Cesar has a timeline. His boss has asked him to kill this man who just so happens to be Arab. The problem is this inmate they want to kill is very paranoid. He doesn't trust anyone. And so Malik, given his situation, they feel like would be more likely to get close to this inmate and kill him. Mostly because they were short on time and, they kind of threatened him. And as soon as Malik hears the news, he's panicked, right? Like he didn't want to do it. And this is very important because it kind of builds, it builds tension. He tries everything to get out of it. He asks the warden, he tries his best to notify the right people. He tries to get sent to the hole. Like he does everything in his power to get out of it. And the more he resists, the worse the situation gets. And this guy, Cesar, is quite serious, right? So we kind of, by the time he makes the kill, you understand his situation, right? Because you're like, I don't know what I would do in his shoes, because it's either me or him, right? Like that's the situation he's in, and the movie does a good job of like making you believe that, like he's really in a tight bind here. And this murder, there are two murders at the center of Malik's transformation. The first one is so messy, right? This first murder, you feel like you're in the cell with him, and the way he kills him, it all goes horribly wrong. He barely is able to kill this man. It leaves such a mess. He's covered in blood. It's almost like a baptism, like in blood. Like it's insane. And you don't know if he's shaking from anger, relief, grief. Like you don't know what he's thinking, right? Because the way that scene is shot, like you can read a lot into his face. Like it's desperation, right? He doesn't want to kill this man, but he's also aware that if he doesn't kill him, he's dead. It's like a do or die situation. And I think that's what I liked about Malik's character. You don't know what's going on in his mind, right? Like he's a very hard character to decipher, but you can kind of read a lot into his face. Luckily for him, he's able to commit this murder, and they do everything they can to set Malik up, but Malik has to finish it. And from then on, he's under the protection of this gang, and he's also haunted by the ghost of this man that he killed. And this is really important because this ghost haunts him until the very end of the movie, until he disappears. And as the movie goes on, like what was supposed to burden Malik, he's kind of unburdened by it. He gets lighter by the end of the film. And I think it's because the worst has already happened to him. Like whatever happened to him outside of prison, you could tell like he was really at zero, right? So life couldn't really get any worse for him. He was just kind of like staying at the worst at this point. And you see that in everything. Like he gets more comfortable with the process. Like when he first enters prison, he looks nervous, but by the end of it, he got really comfortable putting his hands up, right? So this ghost that's following him throughout the movie, it's there to kind of alert audiences that he does have a conscience, but because of all the bad things that have happened to him or he's been forced to do, his back is against the wall. Like he's kind of had to learn and live with it and accept it. And the way the movie notes Malik's transformation is really visually interesting because they do it through this like change in perspective. Like it's almost like he's seeing through one eye. The first time is when we first meet Malik at the start of the movie, when he's beat up, he's in really bad condition. The second time his vision changes and you get this kind of like one eye view is after he kills this man in his cell. And the last time we get this kind of change in perspective is when he nearly loses his eye, when Cesar nearly takes his eye out. And this visualization of Malik's sort of change in brain chemistry, like the movie does a good job of not like telling us things and just kind of using techniques to show us, and that's really hard to do. At the start of his journey, he's very comfortable with the Corsican mob. He does, it could be worse, right? He's waiting on them, he's doing their laundry, but no one really bothers him. But it's interesting because Malik never feels out of place. Like I find that to be really interesting. Like everybody makes it known that he doesn't belong there, but he never acts like he doesn't belong there, he tries his best to blend in, but they constantly remind him that he's Arab, and he's not one of them. And one of the movie's strengths is balancing Malik's performance with Ceaser's performance, right? Like, this could have been a father-son relationship, but it's constantly a slave master, dog owner relationship. Like, every time Malik tries to get close to Ceaser just beats him back, right? If Malik tries to speak his language, Ceaser turns back to French, right? Like, he always kind of reminds him that there's a hierarchy and that I am above you. And Malik tries his best to get into his good graces, right? He tells him what he's thinking, and, it doesn't work because Ceaser doesn't think much of him. And although Ceaser keeps giving him more tasks and more responsibilities, all that does is alert Malik to all his vulnerabilities and all his weaknesses, right? And because Ceaser has such a dislike and disgust for Arabs, he gravely underestimates Malik, right? He thinks this fear will keep him in place, right? And he doesn't really see what's underneath that, right? Like, he doesn't really see what's brewing underneath him. So Malik spends a lot of time in prison trying to find himself. Again, it's like a university prison, right? Like, he's trying to figure himself out. He's learning to read, he's learning to write. But the problem is, he doesn't belong anywhere. The Arabs think he's Corsican, the Corsicans think he's Arab. Like, he doesn't really belong anywhere. And I like this duality because it kind of represents what's going on inside him. Like, he's not, this is like the anti-Scarface. Like, this isn't the rise of a crazy person. He's not like this insane person who rose to power and is blood hungry. Like, that's not who Malik is, right? He's someone who's been kind of put in these desperate situations and he's had to get out of them, right? So he's aware of what's right and what's wrong. He tries his best to balance that, but in the end, he's kind of in this do or die environment. And he never shies away from it, right? And he never overcompensates, right? He tells people, like, yeah, I am using you. He tells the Arabs, I'm using you, but what's the difference as long as we're both happy? He tells Ceaser everything, but Ceaser just keeps using it against him. And so Malik, he's an interesting character because he's part criminal, part more, like, you can see that he has the side of him that he wants to explore, but he doesn't really have the time to. I think the thing I was most impressed by in terms of Malik is, like, the way the movie, like, kind of builds his personality, right? Like, he obviously resents being their Arab, right? Like, the more time he spends in prison, the more confident he gets. And when he's trying to kind of break free, like, Ceaser tries his best to kind of regain control of him, but all that does is kind of harden Malik. And every time he tries to make his own connections and branch out, he's very careful not to use Ceaser as a way to do it, right? Like, when he's making a relationship with a gypsy and kind of establishing this drug deal, he makes it clear that he works alone. When he goes out for deliveries and, these jobs for Ceaser, he makes it seem like he's an independent contractor. When he's talking to these Arabs, he makes it seem like, yeah, I work for them, but I'm not their slave. He does this good job of balancing the fact that, like, he acknowledges that he has a lot of power being associated with this mob, and he uses it to his advantage without voicing it, if that makes sense. Like, he never actively says, well, I work for Ceaser and I think we could do this and we could bring him in. Like, no, he kind of uses his safety to expand, right? And that tells you a lot about him because he looks like this meek kid, but underneath, again, like, he doesn't like his situation and he wants to change it. The longer he's in there, again, like, not only does he get more confident, we kind of see what kind of person he is. Like, we're able to separate his actions from who he is, right? He studies, he makes friends. Aside from that incident of violence, he's not going around the prison fighting people unless he has to, right? Like, the only time he engages in violence is either to save his friends or because he had a gun to his head, but he's not going around the prison, angry, looking for fights and things like this. And, he makes tremendous progress, right? He learns to read, write, learn Corsican. Like, a lot of things happen. And I was reading an interview with one of the writers, and he said, of course, the odds that someone could do what Malik did in 6 years is slim to none, right? Like, this is, like, Malik achieved so much in such a short period of time, but in the interview, he's kind of drawing attention to the prison setting. You don't have all these outside distractions, right? You're able to kind of simplify things within this world, and it's not distracting. Like, it takes kind of otherwise perplexing, out of this world things, And it makes them realistic within the boundaries, you know, and I feel like the decisions the writers did and the filmmakers did, it does enhance the plot, right? Like they kind of take these little micro risks, and you know, you're able to go along with it because it moves the plot along, right? So, and one of those things is the way that Malik is able to develop very fast. And I like this duality because the prison is like a place to be educated in two ways. And a lot of the things that he learns are good things, like how to read and write. But all that does is build his confidence for all these bad things he's about to do, right? Like Malik is very adaptable. He's able to survive. And he's starting to become aware of his adaptability, right? Through two forms of education, I guess you could say. And, you know, during his time in prison, he ends up less lonely than he's ever been in his entire life, right? He also ends up with more than he's ever had. He has a TV, he has a DVD player. In this 6 years, no one has come to visit him. The only people that came to visit him are other people that he's met in prison, right? So he's actually able to form a family, make these connections. And the difference between someone like, you know, again, Malik is an interesting character because even though he's in these situations, he never sacrifices his friends, right? He's willing to do anything to help them out. When his friend gets kidnapped, you know, he's willing to pay anything. Like, he's not the type of person to throw people under the bus to get to where he needs to go, you know. And this is a really important characteristic that they just show us. Malik is at the start of his career, right? He's starting to build those connections that will be vital when he gets out. And Caesar is at the end. And the difference is Malik comes out a boss, right? He comes out on top, whereas Caesar is never a boss. Right, like that's also something. He acts like a boss within these walls, but he answers to someone else. And he's at that point in his career where he's so desperate to be seen as important, and he's so desperate to be respected, and he's so desperate to, like, you know, make it known. And I think he kind of resents Malik for that. So, you know, Malik did more, he had more potential than Caesar had in his entire time period. The closer Malik gets to Caesar, the more we see what kind of person Caesar is. Like, he's a snake, he can't be trusted. He attempts to kill his boss at the end. Whether or not his boss was actually a snitch is highly unlikely, but one thing is for sure, he was willing to use Malik to do it all, right? Like, he keeps putting Malik in these situations, and he doesn't really care whether or not he gets out of it, right? Like, there's a wonderful scene when the first time he's doing a job for Caesar outside of the walls, these guys that he's in a car with in Corsican say, like, we don't really care if he comes back. So Malik is aware that he's being used as a pawn because he's Arab, right? It's kind of like, go talk to these people. If you come back, you come back. If you don't, you don't. It's not really our problem. And Malik, again, like, he's very good at accepting. He never asks Caesar for anything. Caesar just gives it to him, right? And he kind of takes that and uses it as an opportunity. Like, every time he leaves prison, he's able to make advancements for himself, right? And I loved how every time he left prison, Caesar was like, remember, your leave times are for me. And that's the thing, right? Within the prison walls, you know, Caesar knows everything that goes on. You know, he knows everything. But outside of the walls, he has no idea what Malik is doing. He has no idea where he's going. He's just hoping that his fear will keep him in place. But all Malik is doing is taking his connections and using it to benefit himself and create his own, right? And the more he does this and the more successful he is, the higher, you know, he's taking more and more risks. I had to ask myself, why is it that Malik never flies too close to the sun? Like, he makes so many decisions that you're kind of waiting for it to be backfire almost, but it never does. And I think it's because he knows who he is, right? He never hides away from it, right? Like, there's a conversation he has with these Muslims where he's like, you know, they're like, you know, is your head getting too big? You know, or you're just using us. And he says, yeah, I am using you. But as long as you're happy and I'm happy, what's the difference? You know, thug to thug. And he's aware, you know, he's aware of his guilt. He doesn't kind of hide behind it by saying, I was forced to do this. He makes the best out of a bad situation, right? You get the sense that he's burdened by the things he's done, but he doesn't use it as a crutch, or he doesn't try to excuse it away, you know. And I think that's why he's always able to, you know, kind of not fly too close to the sun and get shot down. The climax of the movie comes when Caesar asks Malik to kill his boss. And this is the point in the movie where I knew, like, the irony, you know, and for Malik to do that to him was just like, you know, this Ceaser he's flown too close to the sun, right? He's never getting out of jail. His only hope is that he can be comfortable in there, but he wants so badly to, like, you know, have power, feel like he's in a power, and his ego is so big, right? He lost most of his members. They switched to a different prison, and he doesn't feel as important as he once did, right? And he's using Malik to kind of carry out his biddings. And there's a wonderful scene, like, I think this is probably my second or third favorite scene in the movie, where, you know, they're trying to orchestrate this kill, and, you know, they're all in one room. They're all in this one visiting room, and Ceaser is frustrated because he feels like Malik and his crew are useless, right? So Malik's friend Riyadh is dying of cancer, you know, like, he's like, what kind of state is this guy in? And then to kind of calm the situation down, Malik switches to Arabic and tells his friend Riyadh right in front of Ceaser that we're going to kill him, but you got to just keep going. So he literally tells Ceaser that he's going to kill him, but he says it in Arabic. And Ceaser, you could tell, kind of knew he said something, but because he doesn't really respect them, you know, he doesn't bother to tell. And I think a lot of this movie is about adaptability, right? Like, adapt or die. And Malik was willing to adapt. You know, he wasn't going to sit in a room and not know what people were saying, whereas Ceaser is someone that, you know, never felt the need to adapt. He kind of forced other people to adapt to him, but those days are gone, right? So that scene was perfect, right? Imagine telling this guy, like, you're going to die, and you don't even know what language I'm speaking. Like, that was the best. So when the day arrives to kill Ceaser's boss, like, this second kill was just as messy as the first kill. Right, it was even more of a disaster, actually. And again, Malik is not a killer, right? These killings are so violent, and they're so messy, and they're so clumsy, and they're so, like, spur of the moment. Like, we have to do this. Like, there's this kind of, like, it's us or them energy towards it. And the build up to this murder was intense, right? Like, they're kind of patrolling the streets. You know, you have this posh Paris streets. You know, everybody's going to work, everybody's minding their business, and then you have Malik and his friend dressed in black with a bag full of guns. And there's this one moment where Malik is just pacing up and down, and then he kind of catches a glimpse of these really nice shoes in the window, as if he's window shopping. And I thought that was really funny, because this job is the only thing standing between him and a different class, right? Like, those shoes are worth more than the value of his life at this point, right? And if he doesn't get this done, like, he's zero, right? Or he gets it done and he becomes a king, right? So there's so many awkward moments where they're just looking around, and it was just tension. And when you do get to that scene where he eventually is able to make the killing, it's fantastic, and it kind of goes in slow motion. And I think this last kill, like, he's no longer burdened by it, right? Like, he's not shaking, he's not sitting in a corner, he's not as afraid as he was the first time, and some weight has been lifted off him. Right, he kind of accepts what he has to do, and he just does it. Right, like, he's able to shoot everybody, and there isn't that kind of, like, hesitation. Right, he's not shooting with his eyes closed. Right, he's shooting with his eyes wide open, and he kind of knows what it is. And they end up kidnapping Ceaser's boss, and, you know, that was hilarious. He's like, take your revenge, like, and that was it. Right, like, they're able to complete the job. And for 40 days and 40 nights, he's forced into solitary confinement, where Ceaser is annihilated, right? Like, it turns into a bloodbath. And again, I love the high stakes, right? Like, everybody's life, Malik's future is dependent on whether or not he's able to Malik and Ceaser's future are dependent on what he's able to do outside of these prison walls, right? So Malik made a decision that advanced him, and it was at the expense of Ceaser and his gang, and rightfully so. Right, so 40 days and 40 nights, and he comes back a prophet, right? Like, he emerges a new man, a new day, a new everything. And the whole time he's in solitary confinement, he's asking, where's his ghost? And I had to think about that, you know, and I think he was asking because, you know, he still felt some type of guilt or conscience. Like, he's aware of what he's done, and he kind of maybe wanted to be reminded of it, but the fact that his ghost didn't appear, you know, again, like, he kind of did what he had to do, you know. So by the end of it, there's no ghost, right? He's this burden that was on him, the thing that was keeping him shackled, ends up freeing him at the end, right? And it's really interesting because although he's alone, right, and his friend even dies alone, like, he has more than he's ever had, right? He's less lonely in solitary confinement than he was, when he started this entire journey. When he comes back out, like, I thought this was so funny. Like, Ceaser, word travels fast, right? Like, he's no longer able to sit on that same bench without people moving out of the way. Like, everybody knows he's lost power, and he tries to get his dog back, right? He tries to, like, whistle or, like, tell Malik to come back, but Malik doesn't even look at him, right? He doesn't recognize, Ceaser anymore because he's not owned, right? Like, he's no longer the dog or, whatever it is that Ceaser assumed that he was. And watching this old man get punched in the stomach, I mean, that was really shameful, right? And that's how the movie ends, right? So Ceaser is gone, Malik is at the top, and when he's leaving prison, it's interesting because, he came in as this sad kid that was alone with nothing, and then he comes out to, like, a parade of people saying hi to him. He has a community, he has a godson that he loves and cherishes so well. Like, he takes that so seriously, like, he loves this kid, and again, he had nothing. And the difference between him and someone like Ceaser is that I think Malik really, he adapts well, and he kind of understands the importance of people around him, and he's never willing to throw people under the bus for that, right? Like, he's gonna take care of this kid, he's gonna, like, he tries his best to balance the good with the evil, given the situation that he's in. The movie ends with the song Mac the Knife, and the history of the song is interesting because they've covered it. It's been covered many times, and it's about this knife-wielding serial killer. But the song was originally used in plays, and I believe it was originally written by Germans, and it was to sort of highlight, you have this kind of criminal, and then at the same time it was meant to highlight the sort of hypocrisy of the sort of morality of the bourgeoisie. Like, it's a very interesting song if you listen to the lyrics, and a lot of the lyrics remind me of Malik's first kill, and I don't know if it was meant to foreshadow what he would become getting out of the place. Like, that's the thing, like, what kind of person is he now, right? Like, there's a difference between the things he's done, like, he had to do it to survive, but now that he's outside, how will these things kind of reverberate when he's in charge, right? Like, is he going to end up like someone like Ceaser? I thought that song was quite eerie because it was like, is this what he's going to become? Like, it's really interesting. So overall, this was a great movie. I loved it. There's so much to be said about it. Again, it's fantastic. It's one of the movies that makes you forget that there are subtitles. I don't know how to describe it. Like, it's an instant classic. And there's a lot you could say about it. You guys let me know what you think, and until next time.